Meeting will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare a recess of the committee at any time. As a reminder, members participating in the hearing remotely should be visible on camera throughout the hearing. And as with in-person meetings, members are responsible for controlling their own microphones. They can only be muted by staff when due to inadvertent background noise. And I'd like to remind members that per the guidance of the attending physician on July 27th, members, staff, and all others physically present in an indoor U.S. House of Representatives space, including this hearing room, are required to wear masks unless seeking or under recognition by the chair. In addition, statements, documents, or motions must be submitted to the electronic repository to sccc.repository@mail.house.gov. Finally, members or witnesses experiencing technical problems should inform committee staff immediately. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our hearing, Cleaner, Cheaper Energy, Climate Investments to Help Families and Businesses. I'll now recognize myself for 5 minutes for an opening statement. Investing in clean energy will make America healthier and more resilient and unleash incredible economic benefits for American families, such as reducing the cost of energy, lowering electric bills, reduce the cost of traveling, and creating millions of family-sustaining jobs. By investing in clean electricity, energy efficiency, and electric appliances and vehicles, we will lower energy prices for families and businesses alike and cushion Americans from the volatile prices of fossil fuels. The bipartisan infrastructure law made progress, and the Build Back Better Act will take us farther. For decades, Americans have powered their homes, cars, and businesses almost exclusively through burning fossil fuels. But these fuels come at a cost to our health, to the pocketbooks of working Americans, including rising property insurance rates due to climate-fueled storms, droughts, and wildfires. Whether it's price spikes at the gasoline pump or utility bills, rising energy costs can strain budgets of working families. There are many factors behind the current cost of energy. The impacts of the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, global oil market dynamics, repercussions of natural disasters, and increased U.S. natural gas exports all have a hand in driving up prices. But we are taking action. The Build Back Better Act will put more money into the pockets of working Americans rather than excessive oil company and electric utility profits. Households could save about $500 every year just on energy costs by embracing renewables, electric vehicles, home weatherization, and electric appliances. The Build Back Better Act also will ensure that these savings reach all Americans by making grants and loans available to rural communities and directing investments to environmental justice communities. The Build Back Better Act also will help more Americans make the switch to money-saving and fun-to-drive electric cars and trucks. Thanks to lower maintenance and fuel costs, families can save up to $10,000 over the life of a vehicle by driving an electric car compared to a gas-powered one. These savings are double for rural drivers who often go longer distances and spend more on maintenance. And with the bipartisan infrastructure law, EV drivers will have more places to charge their electric cars and trucks, thanks to a historic investment to build up to 500,000 charging stations across America by 2030. At home in Tampa on Monday, leaders of the Electrical Workers Union cheered the new investments because they have developed apprenticeship training for workers to build the charging stations and electric grid enhancements, and they are ready for new careers and higher wages. The Build Back Better Act also will help cut air pollution and reduce the financial cost of fossil fuels that cost us up to $870 billion a year in lost income and healthcare costs. It will improve the lives of the 70 million people of color who live in counties with failing pollution grades, exposing them to deadly threats like asthma and cancer. The Build Back Better Act invests in environmental justice for these Americans, directing at least 40% of investments to the communities most affected by pollution. And as winter arrives, it's crucial to help more families save money through electrification. When it comes to heating homes, the EIA forecasts that families who use fossil fuels could see large increases on their heating bills, 54% for propane, 43% for home heating oil, and 30% for gas. In contrast, families who use electricity for heat are only expected to see a 6% jump. That's because the price of electricity, unlike the price of gas, remains comparatively stable. And it's just one more reason why Congress must continue to make electrification easier and more accessible to American families. Rising fuel prices are only further proof that we must accelerate the transition to clean energy as quickly as possible. We cannot remain stuck in the past. It's time to look to the future as we invest in the clean technologies that will help lead us into the 21st century and solve the climate crisis. So I look forward to today's discussion. At this time, I'll yield 5 minutes to the Ranking Member, Mr. Graves, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Chair Castor, and I want to thank our witnesses for being here today. It's been interesting past few months as we've seen gasoline prices skyrocket. We've seen the President of the United States send a letter to the Federal Trade Commission blaming it on energy companies. We saw Senator Warren send letters blaming it on natural gas exports. And in the same breath, effectively, we've seen folks like Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor for the White House, asking the OPEC nations, asking Russia and Saudi OPEC plus nations, Russia, Saudi Arabia, Iran, and other countries to actually increase their oil production. And of course, that's similar to a message that we saw out of Senators Schumer, Markey, Cantwell, and Menendez a few years ago when they sent a letter to the then President of the United States asking him to have other countries increase production of energy. Folks are sitting here pointing at different reasons as to the high energy cost and complaining about the high energy cost, yet in legislation that just passed the House of Representatives weeks ago, there's a provision in there that imposes a $10,000 a mile a year fee on pipelines, which is the safest way to transport energy. A bill that the same bill increases the regulatory burden, the same bill increases the royalty rate or tax that these companies are going to have to pay, and folks are around scratching their heads and pointing fingers as to why energy prices are going up. It's pretty clear why energy prices are going up. The President of the United States has shut down the Keystone Pipeline, yet opened up the Nord Stream 2 pipeline for Russia to send Russian gas into Europe. The President of the United States has put a pause on domestic energy production, that a court had to step in and say, you can't do this. There's the thing called the law. These are the reasons why energy prices are going up. Everybody's out there pointing fingers. We've seen the Securities and Exchange Commission and other federal government agencies. They have no expertise in energy, none. Out there telling companies that they're going to be pushing these ESG objectives and requirements that are going to be forcing these companies to effectively get off of conventional fuels. We've seen comments out of our Department of Treasury and others saying that they don't want to make any investments in oil and gas. We've seen none, and we've even seen out of the president's own budget a provision for the Corps of Engineers that says we don't want to do anything, make any investments that will actually reduce the cost of consumption. Finally, Madam Chair, there was a report out of the Senate Democrat staff, the Senate Democrat committee climate committee that said that the policies that Democrats are pushing are going to increase cost of energy. They acknowledged it. They said it in the report. Madam Chair, this is what we're seeing today. The United States actually achieved energy independence in November of last year. We achieved energy independence to where, as Ms. Jaffe is going to be speaking about today, she talks about how a theory that Russia and Saudi Arabia's actions were the ones that are causing energy prices to go up, or at least go up a few months ago. Well, if we're energy independent, we're insulated from actions of other countries. Yet the very actions, the very initiatives of members of this committee and this administration, just as folks are saying, we can't depend upon Russia and China because Russia because they're going to be exerting influence and causing prices to spike. All folks are doing now is trying to trade Russia for China and make us dependent upon them for our energy resources. Madam Chair, these policies don't make sense. They don't add up. And all they're doing is increasing global emissions, increasing our dependence upon foreign energy sources like that from Vladimir Putin, who clearly doesn't share America's values. All it's doing is exporting jobs and increasing the cost of energy that has a greater impact on those among us that can least afford it. It doesn't make sense for any objective that we share. None. It's not in America's interest. Yet rather than recognizing errors were made, mistakes were made, and stepping back, we're watching people double and triple down on these flawed strategies that are increasing global emissions, increasing costs, sending jobs overseas, and subjecting us to greater leverage from countries like Russia. It's mind-boggling to me. Madam Chair, one of the key things that we've got to address if we're going to be successful in moving in a clean energy future is that chart right there. That is the process, the regulatory maze that people have to go through in order to try to actually execute. I had a number of conversations with Mayor Mitch Landrieu, former mayor of New Orleans, who's going to be the infrastructure czar. I told him the biggest challenge in front of him is trying to get through that. It's not just about building roads and bridges that currently take between 7 and 10 years in the regulatory, Madam Chair. It's about trying to do clean energy projects and energy transmission. We've got to address this. Madam Chair, I look forward to working together with you and committee members to advance our shared goals of reducing energy cost, of charting a clean energy future, and ensuring Americans have a place to go to work. Yield back.
Without objection, members who wish to enter opening statements into the record may have 5 business days to do so. Well, welcome to our panel of witnesses. These are industry leaders and energy policy experts who are going to share how the Build Back Better Act's climate investments will help reduce electricity bills and transportation costs, how we're going to address volatile fossil fuel prices, and help transition to a clean energy economy. The Honorable Miranda Ballantyne is the Chief Executive Officer of the Clean Energy Buyers Association. Ms. Ballantyne leads a group of nearly 300 energy customers seeking to procure clean energy across the United States, including service providers, businesses, and nonprofits. Previously, Ms. Ballantyne served as the Assistant Secretary of the Air Force for Installations, Environment, and Energy during the Obama administration, as well as the Director of Sustainability for Global Renewable Energy for Walmart. Dr. Uday Varadarajan is the principal in the carbon-free electricity practice at RMI and a pre-court energy scholar at the Sustainable Finance Initiative at Stanford University, where his work focuses on how to use cutting-edge data and financial policy and regulatory analysis to help drive a just transition to clean energy. Previously, Dr. V served as a program examiner in the Office of Management and Budget, where he helped oversee the $2 billion budget for the Department of Energy's Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy Program. Alex Hergott is the president and CEO of the Permitting Institute, which advocates for changes to the infrastructure permitting process. Previously, he was the executive director of the Federal Permitting Improvement Steering Council, as well as the associate director for infrastructure at the White House Council on Environmental Quality during the Trump administration. And Amy Myers-Jaffe is a research professor and managing director of the Climate Policy Lab at the Fletcher School at Tufts University. She was formerly the David M. Rubenstein Senior Fellow for Energy and Environment and Director of the Program on Energy Security and Climate Change at the Council on Foreign Relations. Previously, Ms. Jaffe served as Executive Director for the Energy and Sustainability at the University of California, Davis, where she led research on low and zero carbon fuels and transportation policy. Ms. Jaffe is the author of Energy's Digital Future, Harnessing Innovation for American Resilience and National Security. Without objection, the witness's written statements will be made part of the record. With that, Ms. Ballantyne, you are now recognized for 5 minutes for your testimony. Welcome.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Chair Castor and Ranking Member Graves, and to all of the members of the Select Committee on the Climate Crisis. Thank you for the opportunity to testify on the Build Back Better Act's clean energy provisions. I want to start by thanking you all for your service to your constituents and to our nation as a whole, and for this committee in particular, to all of mankind, frankly. My name is Miranda Ballantyne. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of the Clean Energy Buyers Association. I've spent 2 decades leading large clean energy buyers strategy globally, including Walmart and the United States Air Force when I was the Assistant Secretary for Installations, Environment, and Energy. But today, I'm testifying on behalf of CEBA's 280 business members, over half of whom are large clean energy customers. And our membership really significantly contributes to America's prosperity. Our members have about 14 million employees and contribute about $7 trillion in annual revenues. And a few weeks ago, we set out a really bold aspiration, which is a 90% carbon-free U.S. electricity grid by 2030. And the Build Back Better Act is a key step on the path to this bold aspiration. So my bottom line point today is that the clean energy investments in the Act are good for business. They're good for electricity prices for customers in particular, and they're good for the economy. So I'm going to make 2 key points in my opening remarks, and then I'll look forward to taking your questions. So first, American businesses support the clean energy provisions in the Build Back Better Act. And the second key point that I'll make today is that energy customers and energy markets matter to decarbonizing the grid in a way that's good for our economy and good for all Americans. So let's start with the first one. American businesses support the clean energy provisions in the Build Back Better Act. Last January, if you recall, there were just a few things going on in our country. Despite that, 3 dozen iconic American brands asked the federal government to take action on clean energy policy. These were companies like Walmart, like the Walt Disney Company. These are companies like Johnson & Johnson, for whom there was a lot going on last January. Fast forward to today, and we have 160 investors and companies of all sizes who have supported the BBBA and the Investment, Jobs, and Infrastructure Act. 2 dozen CEBA members have demonstrated their public support for the clean energy provisions in the Act, including companies like General Motors, Amazon, Google, PepsiCo. Why are they doing this, you might ask? Well, these American businesses know that investments in clean energy can resuscitate our economy. Let me give you just a few examples. Expanding organized wholesale markets to every region of our country can save energy customers $11 billion on their energy bills. $11 billion by expanding wholesale markets. Thus, we really support the $40 million appropriated to DOE in the Act to provide states with assistance for their wholesale market electricity work. Second, a national transmission grid could reduce energy prices by a further 2%. Every $1 billion that we invest in transmission creates $2 to $3 billion in direct customer benefits and can create 7,000 jobs directly in construction on transmission, as well as 1,500 other related jobs. Likewise, clean energy investments create thousands of jobs in diverse geographies across the country. So my second key point is that energy customers and energy markets matter. And with the right legislative and regulatory support, markets can accelerate a carbon-free energy system that benefits all Americans. 60% of Fortune 500 companies have public climate and clean energy goals. 1,100 companies are committed to science-based greenhouse gas reduction targets. 340 global businesses have committed to 100% renewable energy. And we've only scratched the surface of the demand. Since 2008, corporate energy customers have driven 44 gigawatts of new wind and solar. And last year's 10.6 gigawatts was the equivalent of 40% of all new capacity, all new carbon-free capacity last year. How we doing? All right, so I'm going to conclude. Bottom line is decarbonizing our power system is a key component of decarbonizing our economy. The U.S. must lead. We applaud the efforts of this Congress to take steps to do so, and we urge the Senate to also pass this bill without delay. So again, thank you for the opportunity to be here, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. Next, we'll go to Dr. Varadarajan. Dr. V, you are recognized for 5 minutes for your testimony.
Thank you, Chairwoman Castro, Ranking Member Graves, and distinguished members of the Select Committee for inviting me to testify and for your ongoing leadership in focusing on the climate crisis. I'm a principal at RMI, which was founded in 1982 and is an independent, nonpartisan nonprofit dedicated to transforming global energy use to help create a clean, prosperous, and secure low-carbon future. And I'm grateful for the chance to speak with you today about RMI's work to assess the potential impacts of climate investments in the Build Back Better Act on families and businesses across the country. I wanted to start by noting that indeed, this winter, more than half of American households could see energy bills rise by 30% or more because of skyrocketing natural gas and oil costs. Now, I think it's important to note this isn't an isolated incident. This has happened many, many times before. Just this February in Texas, we saw a cold spell that led to daily gas supply suddenly falling by half and led to huge blackouts and about a $47 billion spike in electricity costs over 1 week, as much as Texas usually pays over 3 to 6 years on generation. These kinds of volatile and rising energy costs pose a real threat to the health and financial well-being of families across the country. And to put a finer point in that, in 2019, the country's lowest income households, about 18 million, spent an average of about $1 out of every $6 on energy costs, a rate that's nearly 10 times that of households with above average income. And in fact, nearly half of all Americans pay more annually in energy bills than they do in federal income taxes. So energy really matters. In the near term, what can we do about this? Well, in the near term, things like rapidly strengthening the energy assistance programs that we have in place, like LIHEAP, or through internationally coordinated releases of strategic oil reserves, as the Biden administration is pursuing, are important steps that can mitigate this harm. But that's not the long-term solution. In the long run, the only way to ease the burden of volatile fossil fuel and energy costs on American families is to make the shift to better buildings and vehicles that use cleaner and cheaper energy sources with more stable energy prices. Such a shift could involve the use of wind and solar complemented by battery storage that offer energy price stability and can create durable energy savings for American households, all while reducing greenhouse gas emissions. The Build Back Better Act could help American families and businesses do just this. They could really help the United States reduce greenhouse gas emissions from the supply of electricity and save Americans billions of dollars on their electricity bills and be less dependent on fossil fuels, whose changing prices disproportionately impact low-income households. So how does it do this? First, one of the best ways to reduce both high energy burdens, and especially for low-income households, as well as the disproportionate negative health impacts they face by burning fossil fuels inside their homes, is through comprehensive upgrades to their homes and apartments, health and safety repairs, investments in efficiency and electrification. The Build Back Better Act includes incentives for exactly these investments, particularly for low-income households, such as the high-efficiency electric home rebates, 2/3 of which must be directed to low-income and tribal communities. Now, a second way in which the Build Back Better Act helps mitigate these energy burdens is through new and improved financial mechanisms, such as the extension and improvement of existing clean energy tax credits. These changes can allow customers of electric utilities across the country save money if their utilities and the regulators, in some cases, make the choice to switch to clean energy. Now, we wanted to understand how this could actually work for households that were the most vulnerable to volatile fuel prices. So we analyzed the electricity costs paid by customers of those utilities that are most dependent on fossil fuels today. These are regulated utilities, rural cooperatives that serve 92% of the counties facing challenges with persistent poverty, and publicly owned utilities. Together, these utilities own about 80% of the remaining coal power of the US. And we asked how the Build Back Better Act could impact them. And what we found is that the incentives in the Build Back Better Act, if they became law, along with existing policies, could allow customers of these utilities to see annual savings of up to $11 billion a year by 2030. If these utilities choose to use the incentives that are being offered to them and to reduce their use of fossil fuels and build new clean generation, and at the same time reduce their greenhouse gas emissions by 67%. And moreover, we found that these savings are concentrated in households and regions with the highest energy burden. So in short, increasingly expensive fossil fuel burdens fall on customers with high costs, but the Build Back Better Act makes shifting to clean energy easier, reducing costs to customers while providing help to the regions that most need it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Hergott, you are recognized for 5 minutes to present your testimony. Welcome.
Chair Castor and Ranking Member Graves, my name is Alex Hergott, and I serve as the president of the Permitting Institute, or TPI. We are a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization focused on simplifying the permitting process so that we can both protect our nation's resources and build the critical infrastructure America needs. While we're based here in Washington, D.C., TPI's most important work happens in the field and across the country where most critical project approvals occur. Our team of scientists, engineers, and attorneys recruited from federal agencies, including recent additions of senior permitting officials from the Biden administration, have a long track record of success in balancing infrastructure needs with creative solutions to deliver improved environmental and community outcomes during the permitting process. We are the real-world project delivery practitioners behind the scenes in both the private and public sector who have written 2,000-page environmental impact statements and the additional 2,000 pages of appendices and technical reports. We've been in the trenches, written the laws, and worked alongside agency staff to untangle the web of permitting confusion caused by overlapping and conflicting requirements across dozens of federal and state agencies, 100 permitting laws, and the resulting maze of regulations, executive orders, and judicial precedent that govern infrastructure development. Our mission is to strengthen the partnership between government and impacted communities and industry. We deploy a collaborative, practical problem-solving approach that has successfully guided many of the largest wind, solar, transmission, and coastal restoration projects in the U.S., saving years and billions in costs. TPI members and members of your committee know all too well that funding is only the first step in delivering the improvements promised in the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. But to be clear, to build back better, we first must be able to build. And currently that is not the case. TPI strongly supports recent permitting reforms, along with new training and siting and assistance grants to states, cities, and tribes, but these will yield only modest benefits for those who are invested in a cleaner, cheaper energy future, a status quo that diminishes or at best delays the impact of any new funding currently being discussed in Congress. Developers across all sectors will still experience the same chronic obstacles and process delays. They see consistency in policy, predictability in process, and some basic accountability for appropriate reviews, not guaranteed outcomes or yeses, just a decision in a reasonable amount of time. Unfortunately, this is a human-based system spread across sometimes 50 different decision makers and chains of command, each with their own requirements that are rarely aligned. To achieve real progress, Congress must tackle the underlying sources of bureaucratic gridlock. Permitting reform has been the central focus of Republican and Democrat administrations, yet compromise remains elusive. Americans are already experiencing the cost of inaction. Rising energy costs and volatility in our energy markets continues as we transition from those conventional to renewable resources, as the other witnesses have mentioned. With much of the needed infrastructure still in the earliest planning stages, they still now face a maze of permitting obstacles that developers report are responsible for adding an additional 20 to 30% on total project costs. These costs are ultimately passed on to the public in the form of higher taxes and escalating utility rates. In this system, no one wins. Not the environment, not the stressed U.S. electricity grid, definitely not the ratepayers. Project developers, including many of our members, stand ready to pursue $600 to $800 billion in private investment for new wind, solar, transmission, hydrogen, storage, and carbon capture. The reality, however, is the benefits of projects initiated today won't be realized for 7 to 10 years because of the current permitting system. It could be hydropower plants that are routinely challenged in court, citing conflicting statutory and regulatory requirements. A growing list of proposed offshore wind projects and other onshore on federal land stalled by the constantly evolving rules governing species and wetlands protections. One egregious example is a $3 billion investment in clean energy transmission line that began the permitting process more than a decade ago. The project was finally approved 4 years ago. However, it is now entangled in court proceedings because one hand did not know what the other hand was doing within the same federal agency. This is not a Republican or Democrat issue. This is a process issue. The lack of a predictable permitting process is the enemy of progress, and that uncertainty is keeping hundreds of billions of dollars of new investments on the sidelines. Beyond those existing permitting obstacles, new infrastructure investment must now also contend with the regulatory whiplash with contradictory regulations being proposed and issued every couple years. Projects currently undergoing review, years into the process, are left in a no man's land trying to figure out what to do while agencies provide no guidance regarding decision-making in the meantime. TPI is working to bridge the disconnect between erratic policy shifts and the real-world consequences on the ground. We are building a large coalition of diverse entities committed to achieving a balance between progress and protection. The key is greater coordination and efficiency, not limits on stakeholder participation or shortcuts to laws and regulations. More comprehensive and lasting permitting reform efforts in the past have been blocked by the notion that faster always means fewer protections to the environment. That is simply false. Congress should embrace reforms that expand state, local, and tribal partnerships, such as TPI State Permitting Council initiative that builds trust, communication, and coordination between state and federal regulators. We also recommend this committee take a hard look at achievable compromise on legislative reform initiatives, such as the Builder Act, which clarifies the appropriate role for federal reviews at state levels. And to conclude, if we agree that a project development cycle of 7 to 10 years, regardless of the energy source, is simply too long, we must move past fringe talking points and political posturing and take the next steps together. We have no other choice. By doing so, we will unlock the opportunity to modernize and expand our energy infrastructure while expanding the supply of U.S. sourced critical minerals essential to make these projects a reality. These efforts will safeguard communities, protect the environment while simultaneously securing new domestic sources of affordable energy and the jobs bringing American industry back to life. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Next, we'll go to Ms. Jaffe. You're recognized for 5 minutes. Welcome. Check, Ms. Jaffe, check your audio, please.
Oh, goodness.
There
Sorry.
you go.
Okay.
Go ahead and start.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, Chairwoman Castor, Ranking Member Graves, and the distinguished committee members of the Select Committee on the Climate Crisis. My name is Amy Myers Jaffe. Together with Dean Kelly Sims Gallagher, I lead U.S. and global climate policy research at the Fletcher School at Tufts University. I have written several books on energy, including one on the link between the oil price cycle and global financial crises, and more recently, one on digital energy innovation. I thank you for this opportunity to speak before the important committee today, and I thank Member Graves for referencing my testimony. I'm glad to hear that he and perhaps other members of the committee are concerned about the undue influence of OPEC and Russia on global energy markets, that we don't want to have our own foreign policy, whether that's our climate negotiations at Glasgow or other kinds of strategic policies held hostage. We also similarly want to make sure that we're competing in global markets effectively with China. I think those are concerns that are bipartisan concerns, and I'm going to talk about them today. So the first thing we've learned on energy independence, which I have a nice little diagram in my testimony, is that if we provide extra oil supply, but oil demand is rising exponentially, we can still wind up with increased imports to the United States and instability in oil prices globally. And so really, truly, the best tool we have in our arsenal is demand management. And that in the past has been the CAFE standard, having our vehicles be more efficient. That helps families because they can buy less fuel to do the same trip. And when we think about electric cars, we need to think about that same level of efficiency. Electric motors convert the vast majority of the energy that is stored in the battery, between 60 to 85%, into usable energy that moves the wheels and takes the car forward. By contrast, even a good internal combustion engine is much less efficient. It converts only 40% of the gasoline fuel into usable energy, and then an additional amount of that energy is wasted in the form of your heating a drivetrain. And so we wind up actually only using about 20% of the energy from the fuel we burn in our car. So in effect, electric cars are a much more efficient technology. And over time, the advent of electric cars in the United States and globally are going to remedy the influence that producing countries can have undue on global energy markets. That is a critical tool we have in our toolbox. In the short term, we know what we have to use. We need inventories. We need diverse supply. We need backup systems. But longer term, we also know that public transit is an important part of making sure that every American has access to mobility and can't be held hostage to the cost raise that can be made in the international market. And one of the things we know is that, which we learned sadly in COVID, is that actually of our most underserved communities, that 20% of low-income families don't even have access to an automobile and need services from public transit. So when we think about Build Back Better, we're talking about targeting exactly the needs we need to take to reduce the volatility we see in energy markets today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And I want to thank all of our witnesses for your very insightful and informative testimony. I'm going to start by recognizing Representative Caston first for 5 minutes. You're recognized.
So thank you very much. And before the clock starts, my conflict has been shuffled. So I'm happy to go first, but I don't want to impinge on you if you'd like to go.
Please go ahead and set the table.
Thank you. Ms. Ballantyne, it is such a pleasure to see you and have all your expertise here. Learned so much from you through the years. And I mention that in part because I want to apologize because I'm going to start at a second grade leading level because I don't want to lose any of my colleagues. If I'm looking right now, I'm just Googling on my phone, Henry Hub spot price of natural gas, $3.76 per million BTU. The price of coal has surged. It's about $133 a ton. If I'm doing the math right, that's almost $6.50 per million BTU. And I can't find a spot price for sunlight and wind. Am I correct in assuming that the price of sun and wind is 0 per MMBTU?
You are correct.
Thank you. I was glad I didn't look it up that wrong. The price of power is averaging about $49 a megawatt hour right now. So it sounds to me like if we built solar and wind panels that were using zero cost fuel and turning it into something worth $49, we would generate a return on investment. Do I have that about right?
I'm going to trust you on it.
All right. well,
7 to 12% return.
Yes, thank you very much. I appreciate that.
Return.
Okay, so now if I think the price of solar and wind right now is running $1,000 a kilowatt, maybe installed, something in those neighborhoods. And the last time I looked, transmission and distribution, the full system is a weird way to look at it, but I did a little piece of math, roughly $1,500 per delivered kilowatt when you sort of run through the whole system. Is ballpark-ish. I see some heads nodding. Okay. So almost basically more than half of the capital cost we have to amortize in the system is the transmission system. And I quite agree with, I think with all our witnesses that permitting is a real problem and it's a big chunk of that cost. We did have in the American Jobs Plan that the president proposed a standard office of transmission. Unfortunately, we didn't get that in the bipartisan package and we can't do policy and reconciliation. But I would hope on a bipartisan consensus we can streamline that permitting process in some future bill. My first question, though, for you, Ms. Ballantyne, is we run about 7% losses in the system on the transmission and distribution grid. And so if more than half of the cost of the system, that is going to lower our cost of energy, because I think we just said 12% return, great, that exceeds GDP, let's do it. But if more than half of that cost of the system is in the transmission system and we're losing 7% of it on the way from the generator to the load, are we doing enough to make sure that we are first building generation closest to the load where we can avoid those losses, or are there other things we should be thinking about in that regard?
So I would answer your question directly that we're not doing enough in two regards. You're right, we should be looking at building generation close to load, no question about it. However, as we know, that zero marginal cost, wind, solar, geothermal, hydropower, there's a whole suite, not just wind and solar, of zero marginal cost renewable energy sources. They're not evenly distributed across the country.
Sure.
So we have to invest in advanced transmission as well. It's a critical piece of the pie. And today, interconnection queues are slowing down electrons getting from where projects can be built to where customers' loads are.
Yeah.
We need 2 to 3 times the transmission that we're going to have today. And every bit of investment that's in this act is going to help that.
Well, I quite agree, and thank you for raising the point. And I just want to make sure, and as my colleagues know, I'm a big fan of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. I hope as they can streamline some of these permitting processes and make sure that we build the transmission where it should go in a streamlined fashion, but also fix those downstream market issues. Ms. Jaffe, I want to start again, and I apologize, it's so simple. All else equal, if demand goes down, does price go up or down?
If demand goes down, price goes down.
Awesome. So if we reduce the demand for natural gas by building solar and wind, if we reduce the demand for oil, we're going to lower the price of gas and oil. Do I have that about right?
That is correct.
Awesome. Mr. Graves, you'll be so delighted. We're going to lower the price of consumers across the board. This is fantastic news. Now, if you could just help us out, Ms. Jaffe, because as I look at the last 7-8 months, it looks like the demand for natural gas in the U.S., the demand for oil has not dramatically increased, and yet the price has gone up. And wellhead counts have fallen and exports have surged. Can you explain to us how it is that collapsing wellheads and surging exports might account for some of the increase in fossil fuel prices over the last 7 months?
So I think the way you've described it is not really accurate. What actually happened is we had a huge, unprecedented collapse in demand for both oil and natural gas in 2020 because of COVID. Many American companies stopped drilling. Not having anything to do with federal policy, but simply because there was no demand because of COVID and they were losing huge amounts of money. And then because of the success of the vaccine rollout, we had a sudden reopening of our economy. We had 6% growth, which is unprecedented. I think I can't think of the last time, maybe the 50s when we had 6% growth in the United States. And that sudden resurgence of sudden demand in the United States, more people driving their cars, meant that we, together with the recovery in the rest of the world, created a situation where the cutbacks that we saw in 2020 could not be immediately reversed. That gave OPEC power, and they used that power.
Thank you. I'm over time. I yield back. We could do this conversation for a long time, but greatly appreciate all your expertise.
Next, Mr. Crenshaw, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. Thank you all for being here. I want to talk about what lowers costs for Americans and how to build that infrastructure that does so, because we keep hearing that the Build Back Better plan, the infrastructure plan that was passed, will lower costs for Americans. This is repeated so often that it supposedly becomes self-evident. We have to ask how, because this argument is based on the notion that spending more federal money actually makes these projects easier to execute. Somebody has to ask, is that actually true? Now, you could argue that better infrastructure certainly lowers costs, but the infrastructure has to be built. It actually has to happen. And as Americans are experiencing the highest costs of electricity in the last 20 years, I want to know how the Build Back Better agenda will actually reduce costs, not just by spending money, but by making projects easier to complete. Mr. Hergott, we'll start with you, please, and thank you for being here. During your time at the permitting office, what did you find was the single largest threat to getting a project completed?
Well, I think, thank you for that question, Mr. Crenshaw. I think that there's a bit of a disconnect between the world that everyone wants to live in and the one that we actually live in. And the one that I live in, and in the Trump administration in particular, and although it was little known, we pushed some of the largest wind and solar projects in the history of our country, right? And some of the largest in the world, even though it got me in a bit of trouble. But the reality is that it takes 7 to 10 years for a project that starts today. What do we do in that 10-year period? Especially now that we have supply chain issues that we can't actually address. So at the same time that we're talking about demand and supply issues and a recognition of where that might increase prices, at some point, if you're going to you can't throw good money after bad. At some point, we have to have a roadmap, whether it's wind, solar, transmission. My entity is agnostic. But the bottom line is, if people are putting capital at risk on whatever energy source that comports with the stated national policy and the changing priorities of the whims of elections, we have to remove this, because those 20 to 30% of costs are things that we have to solve, and that are not going to solve themselves. And apparently nobody wants to talk about it in a real way. And those kinds of costs are the ones that are borne on utility bills. And that's and those are the things that I haven't seen addressed by either side, either in the draft versions of the infrastructure bill or in the current Build Back Better plan. Creating a new office within an agency doesn't solve a problem. All right, calling something shovel ready without making it shovel ready doesn't do anything for the American people.
Right, and that does get to a question I was going to ask about the claim that the infrastructure bill took care of these process issues, but you're saying it does not.
Well, while I was in the administration, I drafted something called One Federal Decision, in a recognition that we needed to bring this disparate universe of decision makers and have one adult in the room that would actually drive the process. No shortcuts to the environmental reviews, but that there would actually be not necessarily yes, but a decision given in a reasonable amount of time. One Federal Decision was codified in the most recently passed bill, but that's only for DOT projects. The Federal Permitting Council, of which I ran, which is an extremely successful tool, and Christina Rada, who currently runs it, is exceptional at her job. The problem is that it only has 8 projects, 6 wind and 1 transmission, and it's only for projects that are $200 million and above. Those are very targeted, narrow tools. What do you do with the other 2,000 projects that are stated to meet the 2030 climate goals that are sitting in a period of limbo with no one giving them a hand? And those are both our faults.
Last thing I want you to talk about is how our court system is weaponized and what we could do to streamline the process, which would avoid that.
So thank you for that question. There's currently about 1,200 cases that are a direct contributor to a renewable energy future that are currently in active stages of litigation. Whether that was the most recent rescission of the Migratory Bird Treaty Act that makes it now a criminal penalty to have an incidental take of even one bird, has paralyzed offshore wind development and wind development in Nevada. And solar is the same issue, is being impacted by new changes to the sage grouse. Not even just the NEPA rules that everyone talks about. It's the 60 other permits that are required here that have now created an uncertain regulatory landscape, because project developers have to get everything right. Those that don't want the project only have to get one thing wrong that was a process foul, and they can hold up a project for about 2 years, which oftentimes lead about 30% of the time to project abandonment. And at that case, if we don't solve this issue, we're going to continue to have litigation and have courts making science-based decisions, adjudicating things that should be solved either by Congress or by the scientists in the agencies that make these risk-based decisions.
We could talk about that for a lot longer, and we have, you and I, but I'm out of time, so I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, we'll go to Rep. Bonamici. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair Castor and Ranking Member Graves, and really thank you to our witnesses for your testimony today. We know the financial and social costs of fossil fuels. Millions of deaths annually are attributed to burning fossil fuels, and without intervention, according to the 4th National Climate Assessment report, warming could contribute to an 18% increase in ratepayer electric bills by 2040. But fortunately, the Build Back Better Act's climate change provisions will reduce costs and reduce health problems. So I want to ask Dr. Varadarajan, your RFI modeling that you cited in your testimony reveals that the Build Back Better Act will help ratepayers see an annual savings of about $11 billion per year by 2030 as utilities transition to clean energy. So how will these savings be distributed geographically across the country? And how will these savings help lower income households and support a just transition? And also, does that $11 billion in projected savings depend on enacting the Build Back Better Act?
Thank you so much for the question. To that last point, we certainly believe that the bulk of those savings do indeed depend on the enactment of the Build Back Better Act. The way in which these savings are distributed is impacted by the fact that we've spoken a little bit about how existing tax incentives or existing policies have been uneven in leading to clean energy deployment across the country, that there have been these barriers to moving forward. Well, some of the biggest barriers have been related to the way that these incentives have been structured. And in particular, these incentives have been structured to make it difficult for the customers of municipal utilities, of rural customers of rural cooperatives, as well as customers of regulated utilities to benefit from clean energy in the way that we hope they could. And one of the things the Build Back Better Act does is break down some of these barriers to allow these communities that have so far not been able to have access to clean energy. And when we look at where these communities are located, they're in fact very well co-located. They're communities that have some of the highest energy burdens in the country. So when we look at the utilities, for example, that whose customers may see the greatest savings, some of these utilities are utilities in Wisconsin, in Florida, in Indiana, in Georgia, and in Virginia, utilities in Alabama. These are customers who haven't had the opportunity. And what the Build Back Better Act does is it makes some strategic and important shifts in the way that those incentives are structured to bring those benefits to those who would benefit the most from them over time.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that, and I appreciate your testimony. Ms. Ballantyne, in your testimony, you cite an analysis of 11 studies that confirms the feasibility of reaching 80% clean energy by 2030 at a minimal cost. To bridge the gap between 80 and 100% energy deployment, we need to invest in major innovative breakthroughs that will reduce emissions in hard to decarbonize sectors. So Build Back Better will help achieve this challenge by providing $2 billion for Department of Energy research and development and other investments in innovation. So for you and Ms. Jaffe, what are the most important innovations that we need to materialize for us to exceed the 80% decarbonization? And how will the provisions in Build Back Better support clean energy innovation?
So I'll mention two things. One of the most important innovations is probably one of the most boring because it's not an innovation. We need to expand wholesale organized markets to every region of the country. We often forget about the importance of competition to accelerate clean energy. And we know that wholesale markets lower costs. Building on Dr. V's comments, we know that wholesale markets lower costs, and expanding wholesale markets to every region of the country will make a big difference. Now, in terms of technology, when we think about how we're going to decarbonize the grid, how we're going to plan for threats in the future that look different than threats in the past, whether it's changing weather patterns or whether it's determined adversaries that can attack our grid from anywhere in the world through cyber, we need to be thinking about our grid in a very, very different way. We have customers who are also producers now, prosumers, we call them. We need a much more agile grid that can respond to customers producing their own power and using their own power. So we need software and hardware. I'm going to try to get Ms. Jaffe for the remaining 20 seconds. Thank you, Ms. Jaffe. Innovations?
I mean, there's so much potential. To mention the question of transmission, there's even an innovation where there's a new technology out on the market that would allow us to transmit electricity in major wires without the 7% loss. So a lot of innovation can take place.
Great, thank you. And I'm out of time. Yield back. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Next, we'll go to Representative Miller. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair Castor, Ranking Member Graves, and I appreciate you all for being here today with us. While many Americans across the country suffer from rising inflation, increasing gas costs, and higher prices on every product and service they rely on, the Democrats today want to twist the knife in the wound of the American middle class. In the Build Back Broke agenda, one of the costliest provisions in the entire bill is a tax cut for millionaires and billionaires living in high-tax states like California and New York. This tax break is offset by raising taxes on the middle-class workers across our country, increasing the cost of their necessities and especially their energy. No matter how many times we have what seems to be the same hearing discussing the same flawed logic proposed by my colleagues across the aisle, we are not fixing the real issues. It feels like the movie Groundhog's Day. Instead of focusing on viable solutions to lower emissions, many of my colleagues only seem to focus on pie-in-the-sky fantasies of a world run solely on specific renewable energies. We need an all-of-the-above strategy, which focuses on key base load energy and affordability, while still being responsible stewards of our environment. As winter begins to take a hold across the country, the United States is not prepared to supply our nation with the energy it needs to keep the lights on, heaters warm, and water running. Liberal energy policies have stymied investments, forced banks to withhold credit to traditional energy companies, and created a never-ending regulatory nightmare where it takes years for new lower emitting projects to even get started. As I say often in the hearings in this committee, I am not opposed to renewable energy. I am committed to lowering emissions through smart, market-driven forces. While I appreciate my colleagues across the aisle acknowledging that lowering taxes promotes business growth and technology development, their insistence on only lowering taxes for their pet industries is disturbingly a new trend. The Build Back Broke agenda will increase taxes on all companies in the United States, whereas the Republican Tax Cut and Jobs Act stopped corporate inversions, the takeover of U.S. companies by foreign companies and competitors. The BBB will make U.S. companies less competitive, again sacrificing American intellectual property and U.S.-owned companies to overseas money. We must do more to move into this reduced carbon future the right way. Carbon capture technologies will mitigate the impacts of traditional energy sources without giving up American energy independence, and brings along our energy producing communities like mine in Southern West Virginia. This committee and this president and his administration must commit to common sense energy policies, not kneeling at the feet of radical progressive idealism. Mr. Hergott, would you say that energy projects, whether they be pipelines, export terminals, or power plants that are built today are more efficient and less carbon emitting than those built decades ago?
Yes.
Can you explain to me then, if these newer projects would emit less emissions, why is there not a push to streamline the permitting process to get these projects online faster?
Well, thank you for that question. Up here, you see a pipeline chart that is from the administration that talks about the 80 steps that need to take place. These are the same steps that also affect transmission. There is no difference between the permitting regime that affects clean energy transmission and pipelines. And so the reality, however, is this still takes 7 years to do.
That's too long. Madam Chairman, I yield back my time.
Thank you very much. Next, we'll go to Representative Brownlee. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for putting this hearing together. Ms. Ballantyne, I wanted to ask you, we've talked a lot about, in your opening comments, you talked about how your organization certainly supports the Build Back Better plan, et cetera. Get that. We've talked about permitting barriers, fixing the permitting system. You've talked about the transmission infrastructure needs to increase by 2 to 3 times. So what I'm interested in knowing is, from your membership, what are some of the other, what are some of the other issues that Congress should be looking at?
Thank you for that question. And I actually loved a couple of quotes from your colleagues' previous remarks: smart, market-driven forces, all of the above. SEBA couldn't agree more with those kinds of comments. So thank you, ma'am, for bringing those to the table. The largest barriers to energy customers using their market demand to drive carbon-free, low pollution to no pollution, low cost, reliable power is lack of markets. 80% of wind and solar has been deployed in wholesale organized markets today. And that's not because 80% of load is in organized markets, only about 2/3 of load is in organized markets. Without competition, without choice, markets can't work and customers can't help. So that is the number one barrier. Certainly getting steel in the ground faster, getting projects done faster is a critical component as well. But I would come back again and again to organized markets and transmission. We need those two things to make this market work.
Great. And just on a separate point, I've been a member who's worked on sustainable aviation fuel, and it's been a very interesting journey. And because certainly the environmentalists are supportive, and the airlines industry now, particularly United Airlines, who's really leading the way on SAF, and are really very much committed to it. And so we have a blender's tax that hopefully will stay in the Build Back Better, that will help to develop this market, because that's what we need. I mean, in the aviation industry, that's for the short term, medium term, this is really our only solution in terms of reducing carbon. So can you tell me what other things are needed to develop that market?
So I haven't worked on aviation fuel in a number of years. I will say that there is a parallel organization that's actually been established at Rocky Mountain Institute called the Sustainable Aviation Buyers Alliance that does very similar work to the Clean Energy Buyers Association, and it brings together consumers of aviation services to drive demand for low and zero carbon aviation. So again, putting these markets to work is a critical component. Additionally, what we found when I was back in the Air Force was, even though we had certified our aircraft to fly on a full range of aviation fuels, our partners and peers around the world hadn't. And so when we have our colleagues on our bases, we have to have fuel that works in everybody's airplanes. So this has to be a global solution.
Thank you very much. And Ms. Jaffe, I wanted to ask you, I was delighted in your testimony and your comments really about mass transit, the need for mass transit, and the ability of mass transit to ultimately reduce costs to consumers. Several of us sit on the Transportation Committee. We were pretty disappointed with the amount of money that ended up in Build Back Better towards mass transit. We wanted to we wanted to repair our roads, but not build new roads. We wanted to put all of that money into transit systems. But so based on what we have in Build Back Better, do you think it's going to make a dent? I'm just curious to know. I mean, there is money in there for electrification of transit systems, and certainly money in there for lower income areas. And some money for mass transit. But what do you think we really need to do?
Well, there is something in the bill that really caught my eye, which is helping transit agencies really upgrade evening service and services for the people who really need it. And one of the ways we do that is to modernize. So that means, being able to use, your smartphone apps, and being able to connect to people in a way that you're scheduling transit in a really effective and productive way. And that does require to be able to have the transit authorities have the funding to be able to do that. And I see some of that in the bill. I think that that's important. Maybe having that be a bigger part could be a very positive thing. And also just recognizing that when we build highways, I lived many years in Texas, and thanks to Tom DeLay, the traffic in Houston today is much, much worse than it has been. Every time they expand the lanes, what we learn is it just takes up more and more vehicles, and so you get more and more congestion, which means more and more wasted fuel, which means more power to OPEC. So transit is really an important part of breaking that cycle. And also you get to the point in big cities where the traffic is so bad, you really don't have any choice but to take transit, because otherwise you can't reliably go anywhere. And so it's really an important piece.
Thank you. I apologize, Madam Chair, yield back.
Thank you. Next, we'll go to Representative Gonzalez. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman Castor and Ranking Member Graves, for holding this hearing today, and for our distinguished witnesses for joining us. I was told I could go if my questions were intelligent. I make no promises. There's one thing all large-scale energy transitions have in common, and it's a great deal of inertia. Under most circumstances, energy transitions take decades to achieve, and the greater the reliance on one or two energy sources, the longer the transition tends to occur. That's a historical fact. While this simple truth may seem obvious, it does seem to go ignored. Overlooked are things such as the scale of the shift, any social and economic implications, the lower energy density, the replacement fuels, the inherent intermittency in renewable energy, and the uneven distribution of renewable energy sources. Every transition to date has introduced fuels with superior energy densities, but the one we're discussing today moves us in the other direction. Barring some extraordinary, unprecedented innovation, I am skeptical that we're going to achieve these targets. I say all that while believing a world with less carbon-emitting sources is highly desirable, and the goal is a noble goal. But I do believe we have to recognize that getting there is going to require a suite of technologies. And if there's one disappointment I have with the hearing, frankly, I saw the title and I thought we were going to have a really deep dialogue about how do we actually fund the transition, what the right mix of private and public investment are, where those sources need to come into place. And then I read the testimonies, and it seems like it's basically just a selling exercise for Build Back Better, which we all know is a partisan bill. That said, now to my question. Dr. Varadarajan, I'd like to start with you because in your testimony, you state cleaner energy sources such as wind and solar complemented by battery offer energy price stability and could create durable energy savings for American households. I think could is the operative word in that statement. I'd like to dive into that with you because what I'm most nervous about when I look at Build Back Better and I see the mission of many of my Democratic colleagues to focus on wind, solar, and battery is that we end up being like Germany, where a perfect case study for examining the ROI on subsidizing certain technologies. They've committed more than $560 billion in wind and solar, yet just 42% of its electricity from non-hydro renewables. Large-scale energy storage remaining inefficient and expensive, efficiency rates have plummeted, and electricity prices have doubled. In the first half of 2020, the first half, Germany's electricity prices were 43% higher than the European average. In response, Germany is actively mining and producing a record amount of brown coal and increasing their consumption of Russian natural gas. The result, a 21 million ton increase in German emissions from electricity in the first 6 months of this year. So here's the question. Why should we believe the Build Back Better proposal won't make the same mistakes as Germany, raising household energy costs and increasing our reliance on foreign fossil-based energy sources?
Well, I think the most important point here is that the United States isn't Germany. Germany has the solar resources.
But sir, we're pursuing the same strategy.
Germany has the same solar resources as Alaska. We have the Saudi Arabia of wind in the middle of this country, in the Great Plains states. We have resources just in Arizona that are sufficiently good solar resources that they could power about 100 kilometer by 100 kilometer square in Arizona alone could power the grid across the United States. We are blessed with some of the best solar and wind resources in the world, something that Germany and most European countries can't even come close to. It's because of our prosperity and our incredible the lands that we have that we're able to do something like this and do it in a way that lowers costs over time. And thankfully, technology has changed. Germany made these investments when solar was 10 times as expensive as it was. We are now able to make these investments when, if I look out at the cost of clean energy right now in the United States, if I'm trying to build some kind of new energy, even independent of policy, forgetting about all of that, the lowest cost choice on a per kilowatt hour basis right now is to build solar and wind in most of the country, but not everywhere. I do think, and this is a really important
reclaiming my time for a second, because I have a question on the, so I agree we're not Germany, obviously, right? We have areas of the country that have a ton of wind generation capacity and others that solar would be beneficial for, but you still have to transport it around the country, right? Where I live in Northeast Ohio, that's not the case. We have a lot of cloudy days and we don't have as much wind. So talk to me about how confident you are that we could do all this and not have the cost increases, knowing that you're going to have to transport it across, and I'm seeing I'm running out of time, so maybe I'll follow up in writing with that. But I think it's something that we should all have on our minds. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you. Next up is Rep. Levin. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Chair Castor. I appreciate your holding today's hearing on such an important and timely topic. As my colleagues have noted, the Build Back Better Act represents the single largest investment in climate action in our nation's history. And I'm really proud of the work of this select committee in making sure that we were able to pass such a transformational bill through the House. Today's hearing underscores what I think we already know, that the Build Back Better Act will create millions of good-paying jobs right here in the United States and reduce transportation and energy costs for American consumers while making sure that we can stave off the worst effects of climate change. That's why it's so critical that the Senate seize this critical opportunity to act on climate and put our nation on the pathway to a zero-carbon future. With that, I'll turn to my questions, and I'll start with Ms. Jaffe. You noted in your testimony how the oil and gas industry operates in a boom-bust cycle. As we know, the pandemic has put that cycle on overdrive as gas prices dropped dramatically last March before rising precipitously earlier this year as we began the vaccination campaign. However, these dramatic swings in prices are not unprecedented. Over the last 15 years, we've seen dramatic shifts in energy costs due to global financial downturns, regional conflicts, and severe weather events. And while my friends across the aisle may allege that policies intended to address climate change are the main cause for the current price increases, the facts simply say otherwise. Rather, it comes down to economics. As COVID-19 emerged last year, many operators cut supply dramatically and have not been able to meet the rapidly increasing demand since the beginning of the vaccination campaign. Compounding this was OPEC Plus's failure to reach an agreement on substantial production increases and the fact that domestic supply remains relatively low because investors and banks remain worried about a full resumption of operations given the losses that they have mounted since 2015. At the same time, oil and gas companies are reporting record profits, even as they choose not to increase production to meet the demand. This has even prompted President Biden to ask the Federal Trade Commission to investigate whether these oil and gas companies are illegally increasing prices, even as the price of unfinished gasoline continues to drop. And while the U.S. Energy Information Administration predicts that we'll see gas prices continue to decrease over the coming year, if we do not rapidly decarbonize our economy, I worry that the fossil fuel sector's boom-bust cycle will become even more pronounced in the years ahead as both greenhouse gas emissions and the frequency of extreme weather events continues to rise. The result will be the continuation of this never-ending roller coaster of supply swings and price changes as the American people bear the brunt of unpredictable fossil fuel costs and its associated negative environmental impacts. So, Ms. Jaffe, with that context, in your testimony, you noted that transportation electrification can help us reduce demand for fossil fuels and keep transportation costs in check during the energy transition, which can be helpful for low-income families that often experience the greater energy burden. Can you please expand on that statement, and specifically, how can investments in electrifying our transportation sector, along with parallel investments in electrifying our grid, help protect American families, especially low-income households, from the volatility of the oil boom-bust cycle?
Well, I mean, it was also already been stated, we're going to have these resources. I mean, the great thing about renewable energy is it's inside your border and it's close in. I mentioned, but didn't seem to fully come across, that electric vehicles are just technologically so much more efficient in how much they utilize energy and how they utilize energy. The fact that gasoline is somehow more energy dense doesn't matter because the vehicle itself is so much more efficient. But then to add to the point, which I feel I always need to make, which is that I've lived in Houston, I've lived in Northern California where the fires, I have lived in New England, and I can tell you, having been through multiple hurricanes, that you need electricity to distribute and pump gasoline from a retail level. And so, there's no advantage in a way to the gasoline from a logistical point of view when it comes to storms and resiliency and so forth, because you need the same electricity. And indeed, if you had an electric car and you had a system for backup electricity, you were in a community solar project, or you were somehow able to access electricity, you would at least be able to use your car because you would have that electricity for your car. And you wouldn't have to worry about whether some giant company was able to electrify all the retail stations near your house. So, you know, we're really moving to what I think will be a superior technology, and that is going to benefit everybody.
Well, thank you, Ms. Jaffe. I'm over time, but I wanted to let you roll. I appreciate very much your reply and all our witnesses and my colleagues, and I'll yield back.
Next up is Ranking Member Graves, recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Mr. Caston, I'm hoping to get at second grade level next year. I'm trying hard. So Ms. Valentine, I want to make sure I understand something. So let me ask you a question. If you're a retailer and I'm your supplier, and I increase my cost to you, what are you going to do with that increased cost you're paying for the product?
Are you talking energy in particular?
Sure, whatever. Energy's fine. Yes, that's fine.
You pass it on to the customer.
You pass it on to the customer. You pass it on to the customer. So if the Build Back Better Act imposes a tax of $10,000 a mile a year for pipelines, that's an increased cost. And so companies are baking that in now. If you are going to increase royalty rates, that is an increased cost. Companies are going to bake it in and they're going to pass it on now. So this whole thing, trying to disassociate these actions with increased energy costs, are completely flawed. Mr. Hergott, supply and demand question, because I'm still apparently at a lower level.
Can I weigh in here?
If you hang on, Ms. Jaffe, excuse me, I'm trying to ask a question. So Mr. Hergott, if you decrease supply by pausing through an executive order exploration and production activity, you're decreasing supply, but you don't have a corresponding decrease in demand, what happens?
It's going to go up, especially
prices are going to go up. That's right. And that's exactly the executive order on pausing. That's exactly what's going on. Another question for you, Mr. Hergott. If something is free, as Mr. Caston noted, do you need to put huge subsidies on it in the form of ITC and PT, investment tax credit and production tax credit?
I'm a permitting nerd, not a politician. All right, but I will tell you, you're correct.
All right, thanks. Yeah, so I'm just trying to understand all this stuff. So Mr. Hergott, the Department of Energy under this administration, or the Biden administration, ran several models looking at the energy future. Every single, and I hope if anybody listens to anything I say, listen to this. The Biden Department of Energy just released a report looking at several energy future models. Every single model shows an increase in both domestic and global demand for natural gas. Every single model. As we've talked about in this committee over and over again, the United States natural gas delivered to Europe and delivered to Asia is anywhere from 41 to 47% lower emissions profile. Why in the world would we disincentivize domestic energy production, domestic jobs, domestic economic activity, and yet incentivize Vladimir Putin to do it? I don't understand it for the life of me. I just don't. Mr. Hergott, so you are a permitting expert, and you've spent a lot of time working on this. Let me ask you a quick question. If I'm doing an environmental project, whether it's a solar array, a wind farm, I'm trying to do a wetlands restoration project in the coast of Louisiana, is there a different environmental process, permitting process, that if I'm trying to go build a road through wetlands? Right. Is your mic on? Is your mic on?
No, it's the same.
Okay, so I hope this is something that we can work on, Madam Chair. We've got to tailor the regulatory, the environmental process to the type of project or perceived threat that's out there. Mr. Hergott, if we're talking about financing these projects, what type of threat does the permitting uncertainty pose to the financing?
The debt and equity cost and the default risk that's directly associated with the development risk associated with our failure to solve this can in many cases drive project financing costs up 10 to 25%. That's real. And that is on wind and solar projects as we speak, not on natural gas projects because they're highly capital intensive. There is a direct relationship between failing to address this and the 20 to 30% cost that's associated and passed on to ratepayers.
So back in April, as an example of these delays, back in April, this administration identified 22 transmission projects that were ready to go. What do you think? I mean, just knowing the permitting process, how shovel ready are these projects?
Well, one of them completed because we worked on it. The other 21 projects are still 6 years away. So, and that's orphaning any new solar and wind development. We have to have the holistic, comprehensive strategy. If we're going to build the wind and solar, we also have to be committed to doing the things we need to build the transmission, and that's just currently not happening.
Oh, thank you. Ms. Jaffe, I actually did have a question for you, but I'm running out of time, so I'm going to submit it for the record. But I do want to ask you about supply and demand on critical minerals and how much sense it makes for us to become more dependent upon critical minerals for China. So I'll submit that for the record. Yield back.
Next up, we'll go to Rep. Escobar. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair, and many thanks to our panelists for sharing their expertise with us today. Very grateful to you all. You know, one of the things that is really concerning to me is the desire that I have heard from some to sort of pump the brakes on a transition that many of us now see as urgent, long overdue, long past its time, and in fact, in some cases, far too late. So we have to obviously act with the utmost urgency, and we've got to ensure, from my perspective, we've also got to ensure that some of the most vulnerable communities are able to capitalize on what is an almost guaranteed outcome. I mean, we are going to pass Build Back Better. It's going to happen. And so I think the best use of our time and conversations is to figure out how to best capitalize on that. And my priority is ensuring that economically disadvantaged communities like mine that have long been neglected by state governments and others can best capitalize. How can some of the poorest families, how can some of the poorest communities really ensure that they're ready for the benefits of Build Back Better? And that includes local governments, local nonprofits, consumers, the private sector. And so I'd love to hear from each one of you how you think vulnerable communities like the one I represent in El Paso, Texas, on the US-Mexico border, can best capitalize and prepare so that we can do the best possible by everyone with Build Back Better. Ms. Ballantyne.
Thank you. This is a really important and beautiful question. And I'd like to also recognize that for the members of the Clean Energy Buyers Association, energy is often the second largest controllable operating expense we have for the vast majority of our companies. And our companies employ Americans from every community. So when we expand organized markets, it lowers costs. When we expand transmission, it lowers costs. And those costs are passed through, whether you're a retailer or whether you're a pharmaceutical company, they are passed through. Those lower costs are passed through. And importantly, what we're seeing in communities is these large corporations who have sophisticated energy teams, who are thinking about low cost, low pollution, no pollution, clean energy of all types, not just wind and solar, but all types of renewables. And how can they work with marginalized communities to say, what if we oversized our project so that we could be the guarantee and get the financing for the project, but provide low marginal cost, zero carbon power to local communities, marginalized communities? How can we do more than have our projects just build jobs? How can we build wealth in communities through our projects? So I think that's one of the most exciting areas of development, because marginalized communities and companies share a desire for lowering energy costs.
Thank you so much, Ms. Jaffe.
Well, I think there's so many things in the bill that would be of assistance. And we have things we need to do, because in the end, globally, those things are going to take place. China is going to build these products. Europe is going to build these products. And do we want to be importing all of those products from somewhere else, or do we want to be having the United States economy be competitive? And that goes across an entire range of technologies. I mean, we were leading in digital. We've got companies like Google talking about making home thermostats that would allow you to better utilize and smooth out purchases of renewable energy automatically. There's just so much innovation that's possible to come to market, and it needs the support of the infrastructure that it takes to get that going.
Dr. Varadarajan.
Well, thank you for the question. I think it's a critical one because the Build Back Better Act has a number of provisions that make it more financially attractive, both for individuals in low-income communities and for investors to make the investments that they would deploy in clean energy resources in vulnerable communities. But this is going to require the communities to know about, get access to, and have the processes in place to be able to utilize them. And this is going to take a whole of government effort. It's going to take civil society. It's going to take local governments, city governments, and state governments to engage to make this happen.
Dr. Hergott, I'll submit in writing because I would love your opinion as well. Okay, thank you so much.
Great. Next, we'll go to Representative Palmer. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Madam Chairman, Mr. Hergott, the topic of this hearing is cleaner, cheaper energy, climate investments to help families and help businesses. Does reducing reliability help families and help businesses?
No, it doesn't.
Have we experienced in any other part of the country the lack of reliability, particularly with turbines?
Yes, baseload renewable is still about 6 to 7 years away with the kind of storage and technology, especially with the supply chain issues and the fact that projects that'll take 4 or 5 years from now for lithium, for EVs, beryllium, molybdenum, and several others haven't even gotten off the ground. So we no longer have the appropriate domestic supply chain for critical minerals.
And we've sent from 2011 to 2019, we spent over $2 trillion on renewables, and they represent about 3% of the energy production worldwide and about 4.5% here in the United States. There was a 2021 report that came out on the reliability risk priorities report. Do you have any idea of what they ranked as the top risk to the reliability of our power grid?
It's probably one of the few studies I haven't read. I'd love to learn.
Changing resource mix. Cybersecurity vulnerabilities were number 2, but changing resource mix. So what we're doing right now is we continue this headlong push toward adoption of renewables, which I think anyone who has much engineering background understands that we're not going to get there in the time frame they're talking about. We're putting the reliability of our energy infrastructure at risk. What we just saw in the North Sea, when the wind stopped blowing, you had that massive spike in natural gas, particularly hit the UK hard. It occurred about the same time that Russia decided to reduce their output, supposedly to build their reserves for the winter, which I think was more about sending a message about Nord Stream 2, really did harm to consumers there. Let me ask you this. Does higher prices help families and businesses? Let me ask it in another way. Does it have the potential to harm families when they can't adequately heat their homes?
Yes.
And we've seen this in the UK with excess winter deaths. We've seen it here in the United States. Are you aware, Mr. Hergott, that excess winter deaths kill more residents in Vermont than car crashes?
Was not aware.
It's their own report.
Yeah.
In the winter of 2017, 2018 in the UK, they estimate that there were 17,000 excess winter deaths. Is that acceptable collateral damage for a headlong push into renewables?
No.
I didn't think you would agree with that either. I also want to point out another thing about this. For some reason, we just can't get our arms around the fact that we've got next-gen nuclear that could really pave the way for clean energy for the future. We now have the technology to recycle spent fuel rods, and spent is kind of a misrepresentation because they retain about 90% of their energy. Here's the other thing, though. The life cycle of next generation nuclear is estimated to be 100 years. Can you imagine where we'll be technologically 100 years from now if we convert to that? Natural gas which I think is still a major part of our reducing emissions and providing energy to low-income people and the billion people around the world who don't have access to adequate energy. Their life cycle for a natural gas facility is 60 to 65 years. Do you know what the life cycle is for solar panels?
It has to be rechanged every 4 or 5 years, and substations accordingly.
And wind turbines is 20 to 30 years, but after about 10 years, they begin to dramatically lose generating power. And you can't recycle the solar panels, and you can't, apparently right now, you can't recycle the wind turbine blades. We're having to bury them. I just want to point out, when you raise prices, particularly on low-income people, and for all the rhetoric that the Democrats want to have about Build Back Better, it's raising prices. I keep bringing up to my Democrat colleagues the Pembroke Township in Illinois, about 2,100 people, 85% black. The average income, the median income is about $16,000 a year. They don't have access to natural gas. They're heating their homes with propane and with wood. And the Reverend Jesse Jackson, L. Sharpton, has been trying to get a natural gas pipeline to that city, and they haven't been successful so far. Let me just add this: it might be actually good news for them because natural gas prices almost doubled.
Because we have a vote on them. Sorry, Mr. Palmer, got to finish up. Thank you. And I'll recognize myself for 5 minutes for questions to wrap up here today. You know, everything that we did in crafting the Build Back Better Act was targeted to lowering cost for American families and businesses across the board. That's why when you examine Build Back Better, you'll see policies relating to energy efficiency, more energy efficient appliances for consumers, more energy efficient buildings, electrifying buildings, electric vehicles. Now, you see the electric vehicles and cars and trucks on the road right now bypassing the gas stations. They're going to be, but we want to make sure they're available for consumers all across the country. That's why we were totally focused on making sure that consumers really felt it in their pocketbooks and businesses could save money and pass those cost savings along. But it's not just the cost of electricity, it's also the cost of climate. Build Back Better also takes us down a road of reducing greenhouse gas pollution that we know impacts our health. So let's build in those cost considerations. The cost considerations of higher property insurance because of climate fuel disaster, higher flood insurance costs. All of these costs put together are central to the strategy of President Biden and all of us in building back better and lowering costs. So Dr. V, can you speak to us here, help close us out today on how Build Back Better investments in both clean energy and electrification? We haven't talked a lot about buildings here today. How will that work to help families and businesses lower cost and give them a little relief in their pocketbook?
Yeah, thank you so much again. I appreciate the opportunity to speak to this. At the end of the day, as we look at the Build Back Better Act and the provisions that it contains, what it offers, what the majority of the climate action in this bill offers, is the opportunity and the power and the freedom for individuals and utilities and businesses across the country to make the choice, if it's economically sensible to them, to choose lower, cheaper, and cleaner energy. This is true when it comes to utilities making choices about the resources they want to put on their system. At the end of the day, every single utility in this country is responsible for providing affordable power to its consumers that's reliable. If a utility chooses to use the powers within this act that give it, make it more attractive for them to build grid resources like storage, like transmission to ensure greater reliability for their customers, they can do that. If their regulators agree, or if their communities agree with the input from these key stakeholders, they can make choices they didn't have before to deliver cheaper and more reliable power to their customers. But it's not just that, and this is a really important point. Every individual in the country, every household in the country, businesses in the country can also, because of additional provisions in this act that make it easier for individuals to make efficiency improvements, to choose electrified appliances, to make upgrades to their buildings, they can make those choices themselves and take it upon themselves to make themselves more energy independent. And they can do this in their homes by building clean energy resources like solar, by switching to induction ovens that avoid significant harm from NOx and SOx pollution that cause asthma to their children. These are the types of choices that are available as a result of this act that can ultimately make it possible for each individual company and cities and states across the country to make the choice to move to cleaner energy in a way that reduces their risks and reduces their costs. This is the power of the act. And I think, from when we look at the possibility for cost reductions across the economy, the Build Back Better Act is going to more than pay for itself ultimately in the reduced costs of climate harm and in the reduced costs, health costs associated with reduced pollution within homes and more broadly across our economy, and in reduced costs to consumers. And so I think it's an enormous opportunity, and looking forward to action by all of Congress and by the president to put this into action moving forward.
Well, thank you very much. Yes, we are looking forward to action. We passed it here in the House. It's pending in the Senate. Build Back Better means cleaner, less expensive energy for consumers and businesses across America. So I'd like to thank our witnesses for their testimony today. And without objection, I'll enter into the record first a December 2021 letter from the Solar Energy Industries Association outlining the steps the solar industry has taken to ensure forced labor is not used in the supply chain, and their recommendations for growing U.S. solar manufacturing. 2, a report released today by Rewiring America titled Energy Bill Security for American Households Through Electrification, which shows how American households with efficient heat pumps and electric vehicles will see lower heating and driving costs this winter compared to homes with fossil heating and traditional vehicles. 3, in October 2021, analysis by Resources for the Future that shows clean energy tax credits, included in the Build Back Better Act, can achieve 69% clean power generation by 2030, while lowering costs for ratepayers by 3%. And 4, a December 2021 analysis by Resources for the Future and the Clean Energy Buyers Institute that shows building a transmission macrogrid would add an estimated $5 to $10 billion in annual net benefits and would reduce national average retail electric rates by approximately 1% to 2%. Without objection, all members will have 10 business days within which to submit additional written questions. For the witnesses, I ask our witnesses to respond promptly. And thank you again for joining us at this hearing. The meeting is adjourned.